next week. Yeah, next week at Livewire, and we're performing a set that's about 30 to 35 minutes long, and yep, it's gonna play right now. I'm using the Schecter. Okay, Schecter 7-string. Although in the band we only used the 6-string, so but this is the guitar I have here, so this is what we're gonna use to play. I don't have it plugged into anything fancy whatsoever, so you're getting the raw audio from the set that's being played through there, and then raw audio coming out of the amp right here. Schecter is going through the pedals. This is what it sounds like. So if anybody pops in, I'll be jamming. So let's get started. thanks so much, Yvette. Hello, Sultana. I'm just playing to the set list. I'm in a band called Inner Decay. Here comes the next song. I'm just gonna pause for a second right there just to say hi to Yvette and Shah Swat. So I'm a musician from Chicago. Where's everybody from? Where are you guys from? I'm in Chicago right now. I'm in my studio and I'm just rehearsing the songs because I'm gonna play a live concert next week. And so I'm just going over the riffs, and I figure I can just come live for you guys because the songs are fresh in my head. So using the Schecter, this is Schecter 7-string right there. California, all right. Yeah, pleasure to meet you. Thanks for subbing to the channel. Yeah, I put up a lot of tutorial videos here on the channel, and so there's a lot to learn, a lot of easy stuff. This is a little bit more complex. It's death metal. It's for the band Inner Decay, who I play guitar for right now. So yeah, we're gonna play a show next week, live concert at a place called the Live Wire. So very exciting. As you can see, I like UFOs, so I got my little UFO shirt on here. So, and what you're hearing is my amp right here. That's the amp is going through right there. Hey, Stever, how you doing? And then I'm playing the set list, so I just paused it momentarily. So the next song on the list is called Viral Death. And you guys can look that up if you like. Where did you learn? That was like 40 years ago when I was 14. I learned from a lot of different musicians and a lot of friends. And here I am now, so, yep. All right, so I'm gonna get back to it. I'm gonna keep rehearsing the set because this is where, towards the middle of the set. So let's keep going. This is gonna be Viral Death. So here we go. was a lot of fun. Let's do another one. Here we go. Guys, Milton, hello, play the Sultan Swing. I started laughing when you commented that. That was pretty good. And anybody else joining me? I'm Frank. I am Artem Morbid musician. I'm playing on a Schecter 7-string guitar. If you're joining me for the first time, thank you. I play in a death metal band called Inner Decay, and we have a show coming up next week at the Livewire. And what you're hearing now is the set list that I'm gonna be playing with them. So I'm just rehearsing. I figure I'll bring it to you live. So just having a lot of fun. Let's move on to the next song. This one's called Down the Civilization. So let's get into it. right, let me pause it here for a second. Getting a little crazy here. What's going on? Monochrome 2020. How's it going? Yeah, Schecter, Schecter guitar, 7-string, bad boy. How's it going? Where's everybody from? I'm from Chicago. I'm in my studio and I'm rehearsing a set list that I'm going to be performing with a band called Inner Decay. We're playing the Live Wire next week, so I'm preparing for that. I'm slopping it up. I mean, I'm just having a lot of fun. But yeah, it's a pleasure to meet you guys. I rarely go live, so this is pretty interesting. This is just rehearse, on my own, and so I figure, you know what, I got the set list right now. Let me just play it, and then play to some of the people that pop up, and it's been a lot of fun. So the name of the album we have here. Let me see. That song was actually off one of their older albums. Yeah, so that was Down to Civilization. And then we have one last song that I actually do a solo in towards the very end. I don't have any fancy interface connected to the phone, so what you're hearing is the raw sound from the amp. And then the laptop is playing the set list. So, so I'm just having a lot of fun playing for you guys. This is pretty cool. So let's do the last and final song. All right, here we go. Let's play it. All right, that's it, guys. Thanks so much for coming in and visiting. I appreciate it. And I'll see you guys on the next one. All right, bye-bye.